Sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones we've lost touch with. Family bonds, broken by pride and silence, leave scars that time alone cannot heal. Marcus Stone had spent 40 years in the mountain wilderness, choosing solitude over the pain of reconciliation with his brother. Now his brother was gone, and Marcus inherited the old family homestead in the Rocky Mountains. Walking through the dusty rooms filled with memories, he expected only regret and empty spaces. But beneath a loose stone near the fireplace, he found something that changed everything, a hidden cellar filled with journals and blueprints from their family's past. The pages revealed secrets from after the Civil War that explained why two brothers had chosen decades of silence over truth. What family secret could be so powerful it tore them apart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine trees like memories refused to let go of the heart. Marcus Stone stood on the weathered porch of his mountain cabin, watching the sun paint the Rocky Mountain peaks in shades of gold and amber. At 63, his beard had turned the color of fresh snow, and his hands bore the calluses of 4 decades spent wrestling a living from the wilderness. The leather-bound journal in his lap contained meticulous records of every trap set, every storm weathered, every season survived in these remote heights. He had built this life deliberately, stone by stone, silence by silence. The cabin sat at nearly 9,000 feet, accessible only by a treacherous mountain trail that discouraged all but the most determined visitors. Marcus preferred it that way. The last uninvited guest had been a lost hiker 3 summers ago, and before that, a pair of geologists who'd taken a wrong turn 5 years back. Both times, he'd pointed them toward civilization and watched them disappear down the mountain with relief. The inheritance letter had arrived 2 weeks ago, carried up the mountain by old Pete Jameson, the mail carrier who made the monthly trek to check on the handful of hermits and hunters who called these peaks home. Pete had known better than to linger. Marcus wasn't known for his hospitality. But the letter had changed everything. Thomas Stone, his younger brother by 3 years, was dead. Heart attack, according to the brief legal notice. The funeral had already passed another reminder of how completely Marcus had severed himself from the world below. Thomas had left him everything: the old family homestead, 300 acres of Rocky Mountain wilderness, and whatever remained of the Stone family legacy. Marcus traced the edges of the letter with fingers that had forgotten the feel of paper that hadn't been written by his own hand. 40 years. Had it really been that long since he'd last seen Thomas? The memory came back reluctantly, like a photograph developing in slow motion. 2 young men standing in the doorway of this very homestead, voices raised in anger, accusations flying like arrows meant to wound, words that couldn't be taken back, pride that wouldn't bend, and a choice that had seemed like the only option at the time. He closed the journal and stood, joints protesting the movement. Inside the cabin, everything reflected a life pared down to essentials: a wood-burning stove that could heat the single room, shelves lined with preserved food, ammunition, and the few books he'd allowed himself to keep, a bed built from pine logs he'd cut himself, tools hanging on hand-forged hooks, nothing unnecessary, nothing that couldn't be replaced or repaired by his own hands. But today, necessity was calling him down from the mountain. The descent took most of the morning. Marcus rode Saber, a sturdy mountain horse who knew these trails better than most humans knew their own. In neighborhoods, they followed paths that switchbacked through dense forests of pine and aspen, past streams that ran clear and cold even in late summer, through meadows where elk grazed without fear of the solitary rider who'd become part of their landscape. As they dropped in elevation, signs of civilization began to appear. First, the distant hum of traffic on the state highway, then power lines cutting geometric scars through the forest. Finally, the scattered houses of folks who liked their privacy but hadn't committed to complete isolation. Marcus nodded to Mrs. Henderson, hanging laundry behind her log home. She waved back with the cautious friendliness mountain people, showed each other respectful distance wrapped in genuine concern. The Stone family homestead sat in a valley that opened like cupped hands between two ridges. Marcus saw it from a mile away and pulled Saber to a stop, his breath catching in his throat. He'd expected decay, abandonment, the slow surrender of human ambition to mountain weather and time. Instead, the house stood like a fortress against the valley floor, its stone walls weathered but intact, its steep metal roof gleaming in the afternoon sunday. Thomas had maintained it. Somehow, despite everything that had passed between them, his brother had kept their childhood home alive. The house was larger than Marcus remembered, or perhaps his mountain cabin had simply trained him to think small. 3 stories of native stone and timber, with deep-set windows that watched the valley like patient eyes, a wraparound porch that had hosted countless summer evenings in their youth, outbuildings that included a barn large enough for a dozen horses, a workshop, and what looked like a modern generator shed Thomas had brought electricity to their remote valley. Marcus dismounted and led Saber to the barn, muscle memory guiding him to the stall where his own horse had lived during their teenage years. Fresh hay waited in the manger. Thomas had been expecting him, somehow. The front door wasn't locked. Mountain people rarely bothered with such precautions, trusting in distance and community vigilance for protection. Marcus stepped across the threshold and felt the weight of memory settle on his shoulders like a familiar coat. The main room stretched from the front door to the back of the house, dominated by a massive stone fireplace that could burn logs the size of tree trunks. Hand-hewn beams supported the ceiling, darkened by decades of wood smoke and age. The furniture was simple but well-made pieces their father had crafted in the workshop, pieces that had witnessed family dinners and Christmas mornings, arguments and reconciliations, or what should have been reconciliations. Marcus walked through the house like a ghost, revisiting his own life. The kitchen still smelled faintly of coffee and bacon grease. The dining room table bore cup rings and scratches from homework sessions and family meetings. Upstairs, his old bedroom remained exactly as he'd left it, at 23 books on the shelves, clothes still hanging in the closet, as if Thomas had been waiting for his return. Thomas's room told a different story. The bed was neatly made, but the nightstand held prescription bottles and a pair of reading glasses. The closet contained clothes sized for an older man's comfort rather than a young man's style. A small desk by the window was covered with papers, bills, correspondence, what looked like research notes. Thomas had lived here alone for 4 decades, maintaining not just the house, but the illusion that his brother might someday come home. The guilt hit Marcus like a physical blow. He gripped the door frame, struggling to breathe through the sudden weight in his chest. All these years, he'd nursed his anger like a sacred flame, believing himself the wronged party, the one who'd been driven away by family betrayal. But Thomas had never left. Thomas had stayed and preserved everything. Marcus had abandoned. Downstairs again, Marcus forced himself to look more carefully at the details. The house showed signs of recent habitation, but also recent absence. Mail stacked on the kitchen counter, fresh supplies in the pantry, but dust beginning to settle on surfaces that had once been wiped clean daily. Thomas had been gone for at least 2 weeks, probably died the same day the lawyer had sent the inheritance notice. In the living room, Marcus noticed something that made him pause. The stones around the fireplace were all fitted perfectly, except for one, about knee-high on the right side. It sat slightly proud of its neighbors, as if it had been removed and replaced many times. The mortar around its edges was cleaner, newer. He knelt and pressed his fingers around the stone's perimeter. It moved slightly under pressure. Working carefully, Marcus managed to pull the stone free, revealing a hollow space behind it. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, was an ornate brass key and a folded piece of paper. The note was in Thomas's handwriting, the same careful script their father had taught them both. "Marcus, if you're reading this, you've finally come home. The key opens what our family has protected for 5 generations. Below the kitchen, behind the root cellar door, you'll find the truth about who we are and why I could never leave. I'm sorry we wasted so many years in silence. There wasn't another way. Marcus stared at the key, feeling its weight in his palm. It was old, much older than the house itself, with intricate engravings that spoke of craftsmanship from another era. Whatever lay hidden in this house had been important enough to drive 2 brothers apart for 4 decades, important enough for Thomas to sacrifice his own happiness to protect. The kitchen floorboards revealed their secret when Marcus lifted the rug near the pantry. A section of floor had been carefully cut and hinged, creating a trapdoor that opened onto wooden steps, leading down into darkness. The air that rose from below was cool and dry, carrying scents of aged wood and old paper. Marcus lit an oil lamp from the kitchen counter. Thomas had left it ready for this moment and descended into the earth beneath his childhood home. The steps led to a narrow corridor that opened into a hidden cellar, carved from the bedrock itself. And there, waiting in the lamplight like secrets given form, lay the answers to questions Marcus hadn't even known he should ask. The cellar was organized like a library, with wooden shelves lining the walls and tables arranged in the center. But instead of books, the shelves held journals, rolled maps, bundled letters, and wooden boxes of various sizes. Everything was carefully preserved, protected from moisture and time by the stone walls and dry mountain air. A newer addition sat near the entrance, a modern dehumidifier connected to the generator power, ensuring that whatever lay hidden here would survive for future generations. Thomas had brought the 21st century into this 19th century secret, bridging the gap between past and present with the same care he'd shown for everything else. Marcus set the lamp on the central table and picked up the first journal his fingers encountered. The leather cover was worn smooth by handling, and the pages inside were filled with careful handwriting in faded ink. The first entry was dated March 15th, 1863, and began, "Today, we received word that the Confederates know about our route. Father says we must be more careful, but the next group of travelers cannot wait. Freedom delayed is freedom denied." The words hit Marcus like cold water. Travelers, roots. His family hadn't just lived through the Civil War, they'd been part of it, actively involved in something dangerous enough to require absolute secrecy. He turned the page and found detailed maps of the surrounding mountains, marked with symbols he didn't recognize, and notes about safe houses, supply caches, and what could only be escape routes. The Stone family had been running a station on the Underground Railroad. Marcus sank into the chair beside the table, the journal trembling in his hands. Everything he thought he knew about his family history was shifting, revealing layers of complexity and moral courage he'd never suspected. The inheritance Thomas had left him wasn't just a house and land, it was a legacy of resistance, sacrifice, and the kind of principled stand that defined character across generations. No wonder Thomas had never been able to leave. No wonder he'd been willing to sacrifice his relationship with his brother to protect this secret. Some truths were too important to abandon, even for family peace. Marcus reached for another journal, this one more recent, and opened it to find his brother's handwriting from just a few months ago. Marcus finally wrote back to the lawyer about father's estate. "I know he'll come now that I'm gone. I pray he'll understand why we couldn't tell him the truth 40 years ago. The secret wasn't just about the past, it was about protecting the future." The lamp flame flickered in the still air, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Marcus sat, surrounded by the carefully preserved evidence of his family's hidden life, finally beginning to understand the weight Thomas had carried alone for 4 decades. The knowledge that some secrets were worth a lifetime of solitude, and that sometimes the greatest act of love was letting someone walk away, rather than burdening them with a truth too dangerous to share. But now the burden was his, and Marcus Stone was about to discover that some family legacies reach across generations to demand justice, sacrifice, and choices that echo through time. The hidden cellar key felt warm in Marcus's palm as he descended the stone steps once more, this time with purpose rather than discovery. Dawn light filtered through the kitchen window above, casting pale rectangles on the cellar floor through the open trapdoor. He'd spent a restless night in his old bedroom, dreams filled with fragments of conversation and half-remembered arguments, his mind wrestling with the implications of what lay beneath his childhood home. The cellar seemed different in the morning light that managed to reach its depths, less mysterious perhaps, but more substantial. Real. The shelves of journals and documents weren't the products of his imagination or the romantic fantasies of a man too long removed from human complexity. They were evidence of choices made by real people who had faced consequences Marcus was only beginning to understand. He approached the nearest shelf systematically, like a scholar examining an archive. The journals were arranged chronologically, spanning from 1861 to 1866. Maps were rolled and stored in wooden tubes, each labeled with dates and cryptic notations. Letters were bundled by year and bound with ribbon that had faded from red to pale pink. Everything bore the careful organization of people who understood that details could mean the difference between life and death. Marcus selected a journal from 1863 and opened it to a random page. The handwriting belonged to his great-grandfather, Jeremiah Stone, written in the steady script of a man accustomed to recording important information under difficult circumstances. April 3rd, the Hartwell family reached us safely despite the storm. 8 souls total, including 2 children younger than 10. Mary Hartwell is with child and near her time. We dare not move them until she's delivered and strong enough for the mountain passage. Confederate patrols have increased in the valley. Jacob spotted riders 3 times this week, always heading toward the Morrison place. I fear our neighbors grow suspicious of the traffic through our land. Marcus turned the page, finding a detailed sketch of the house's layout, with notations about hidden passages and emergency exits. His great-grandfather had drawn escape routes through the walls themselves, marked locations for concealed food stores, and noted sightlines for watching the valley approaches. The family home had been designed not just as a residence, but as a fortress. Another entry, dated a week later, revealed the outcome. Mary Hartwell delivered a healthy son on the 7th. We named him Freedom, for obvious reasons. The family departed yesterday with Samuel's group, bound for Canada via the northern route. I pray they find the peace that has been denied them here. Each safe passage strengthens my resolve, but Elizabeth worries for our own children. What legacy do we leave them if we die for strangers? What legacy do we leave if we don't? The moral weight of those words settled on Marcus like stone. His ancestors had risked everything, their lives, their children's future, their own safety to help strangers find freedom. The house he'd grown up in had been a beacon of hope for people whose names history would never record, whose stories would die with them, if not for these careful journals. He pulled another bundle of documents from a higher shelf. These were different official-looking papers with government seals and formal language. Land grants, correspondence with Union officials, and what appeared to be military orders. One document, signed by someone whose title read, Department of War Intelligence, authorized the Stone family to provide assistance and safe passage to military personnel and civilians engaged in operations of strategic importance, and to the Union cause. Marcus's hands stilled as he read the implications. His family hadn't just been running an underground railroad station. They'd been working directly with the federal government, providing safe passage for spies, escaped prisoners of war, and others whose work was too sensitive for official channels. The stakes had been far higher than he'd imagined. A leather portfolio on the central table contained maps of the entire Rocky Mountain region, marked with routes that connected to other safe houses hundreds of miles away. The network was vast, sophisticated, and deadly serious. Symbols marked locations where supplies were cached, allies could be trusted, and dangers were known to exist. The mountains Marcus had spent 40 years learning as a place of solitude had once been highways for people risking everything for freedom. But it was the final journal that changed everything. Marcus thought he understood about his family's story. This one was different from the others, newer, bound in different leather, with pages that hadn't yellowed as much with age. The handwriting was still Jeremiah Stone's, but the dates were from 1866, after the war had ended. The entries told a story Marcus wasn't prepared to read. June 15th, 1866. The war is over, but our work continues. The government men came again today, asking about the Confederate gold. They believe we know where it's hidden, refuse to accept that we never helped the enemy. Our reputation for secrecy now works against us. How do we prove the purity of our cause to men who see conspiracy in every shadow? Marcus read the entry twice, then a third time. Confederate gold? His family had been accused of helping the Confederacy. Everything he'd just learned about their work with the Underground Railroad suggested the opposite. He turned the page urgently, seeking answers. June 22nd, more riders came. These weren't government men, private treasure hunters, bounty seekers drawn by rumors of hidden Confederate wealth. They threatened Elizabeth and the children when I refused to show them our cellars. I fear word of our secret rooms has spread beyond those we trusted. The very passages that once meant salvation for the innocent now make us suspects in the eyes of the greedy. The entries that followed painted a picture of increasing harassment and danger. Post-war chaos had created opportunities for men who cared nothing for the causes that had motivated the conflict, only for the wealth it might have left behind. The Stone family's reputation for secrecy, their known involvement in wartime activities, and their remote location had made them targets for every treasure hunter and fortune seeker in the territory. July 4th, Independence Day, but I feel anything but free. Today, I made the hardest decision of my life. I have hidden the most important documents where only family can find them. If something happens to Elizabeth and me, our children must know the truth about what we did and why we did it. But they must also know the danger that knowledge brings. Some secrets are safer buried than revealed. Marcus found his hands shaking as he reached the final entry in the journal. July 10th, 1866. The men came back with guns. They broke into the house while Elizabeth was teaching the children their letters. When I still refused to show them hidden gold that doesn't exist, they threatened to hurt my family. I told them about the documents, hoping that proof of our Union loyalty would convince them they were hunting shadows. I was wrong. They took everything they could carry and burned the rest. But they missed the cellar behind the kitchen. The real evidence remains safe, along with something else, something that must never be found by the wrong people. The journal ended there, but a loose page tucked into the back cover bore a different handwriting, younger, more rushed, with ink blots suggesting it had been written in haste. Father and mother died in the fire 3 days ago. The men who came for treasure found only what father wanted them to find, copies and decoys he'd prepared for such a day. The real documents remain hidden, along with the items father said must never be lost. I'm taking my sister west, where no one knows our name. We'll start fresh and let the Stone family secret die with us. But if our descendants ever return to this place, they must know the truth. We weren't treasure hunters or Confederate sympathizers. We were Americans who believed freedom was worth any sacrifice. The proof is below, waiting for someone worthy to find it. It was signed J. Stone, junior son of Jeremiah and Elizabeth, July 1866. Marcus set the page down with trembling fingers. His great-grandfather had died protecting a secret that had been misunderstood by history. The harassment, the accusations, the treasure hunters, all based on a lie that had grown in the telling until it overshadowed the truth of what the Stone family had actually done. But there was more. The mention of something else that must never be found suggested the cellar held items beyond these journals and maps. things valuable enough or dangerous enough that a dying man had considered them worth protecting at the cost of his life. Marcus stood and examined the cellar more carefully, looking for signs of additional hiding places. The stone walls seemed solid, but after finding the secret entrance, he'd learned not to trust appearances. He ran his hands along the shelves, checking for hidden compartments or false backs. Behind a row of journals on the far wall, his fingers found a section of wood that felt different, newer, perhaps, or crafted from different timber. When he pressed on it, the panel moved slightly. It wasn't a hidden compartment, but a concealed door, cleverly fitted to blend with the surrounding shelving. The brass key from the hearthstone fit perfectly into a hidden lock mechanism. The door swung open on well-oiled hinges, revealing a second chamber that had remained sealed for over a century. Inside, Marcus found the real treasure his family had died protecting. Not gold or jewels, but something far more valuable to the right people. Original documents that could rewrite the history of the Civil War. Maps showing the true extent of the Underground Railroad network. Personal letters from Abraham Lincoln authorizing special operations, military intelligence reports that had shaped the course of the war, and in a specially constructed case at the back of the chamber, items that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. The artifacts weren't just historical documents, they were proof of things that powerful people might prefer to keep buried, evidence of wartime decisions that could embarrass governments and families even today. His great-grandfather had hidden not just the past, but the potential for scandal that could reach into the present. Marcus understood now why Thomas had never left, why he'd sacrificed his relationship with his brother to remain the guardian of these secrets. The wrong people finding this cache could destroy reputations, alter historical narratives, and unleash treasure hunters who would stop at nothing to claim their prizes. But as Marcus stood in the hidden chamber, surrounded by artifacts that represented his family's commitment to justice and freedom, he also realized something else. Thomas's death might not have been the natural passing of an aging man. Someone else might know about the Stone family secret, and they might have been waiting for the last guardian to die before making their move. The sound of footsteps on the kitchen floor above froze Marcus's blood. Someone was in the house. Marcus extinguished the oil lamp with one quick breath, plunging the hidden chamber into absolute darkness. The footsteps above continued, measured, deliberate, not the random wandering of a lost hiker or curious neighbor. Someone was searching the house systematically, room by room. He felt his way to the chamber entrance and closed the concealed door as quietly as possible, then moved through the main cellar toward the stairs. His mountain-trained senses, sharpened by decades of hunting and avoiding danger, catalogued every sound from above. 2 people, maybe 3, moving with the coordination of a team rather than the casual exploration of trespassers. Marcus reached the base of the cellar stairs and paused, listening. The footsteps had moved to the kitchen, directly overhead. He could hear muffled voices too quiet to make out words, but the tone suggested professional communication rather than casual conversation. These weren't treasure hunters or curious locals. They were something more organized, more dangerous. A board creaked near the pantry, almost directly above the hidden trapdoor. Marcus held his breath, wondering if the concealed entrance was as well hidden as Thomas had believed. The voices continued for several more minutes, then moved toward the front of the house. He heard the front door open and close, followed by the sound of vehicles starting up and driving away. Marcus waited another 10 minutes before climbing the cellar stairs and emerging into the kitchen. The morning sun, streaming through the windows, seemed unnaturally bright after the darkness below. Everything appeared normal, no signs of forced entry, nothing obviously disturbed. But something felt different, wrong in a way he couldn't immediately identify. Moving through the house, Marcus found subtle evidence of the intrusion. Drawers that had been opened and carefully closed, but not quite aligned as they'd been before. Books on shelves shifted slightly from their original positions. Someone had conducted a professional search, looking for something specific while trying to avoid detection. In Thomas's bedroom, Marcus found what he was looking for, confirmation that his brother's death hadn't been natural. The prescription bottles on the nightstand had been moved, and one was missing entirely. The papers on the desk were rearranged, shuffled through by hands, looking for specific information. Most telling, the layer of dust that had begun to settle since Thomas's death was disturbed in patterns that suggested recent, careful examination. Marcus sat heavily in Thomas's desk chair, the implications crashing over him like an avalanche. His brother hadn't died of natural causes. He'd been murdered, probably poisoned with his own medication to make it appear like an accidental overdose or heart failure. The searchers who'd just left were likely the same people responsible for Thomas's death, and they'd returned, hoping to find what they'd failed to locate before. But why wait until after the funeral to search? Marcus pulled out his brother's correspondence and found his answer in a letter from the family lawyer, dated just 3 days before Thomas's death. The lawyer had written to inform Thomas that Marcus had finally responded to inquiries about their father's estate and was prepared to come down from the mountain to settle inheritance matters. The timing wasn't coincidental. Thomas's killers had learned about Marcus's impending visit and realized they needed to act quickly. They'd murdered Thomas and searched the house, but they hadn't found the cellar entrance. Now they were back, hoping that Marcus's arrival might reveal what they'd missed. Which meant they were watching, waiting. Marcus moved to the window and scanned the valley carefully. The stone homestead sat in a natural bowl, surrounded by forested ridges, beautiful but also isolated and easy to observe from multiple vantage points. Anyone with patience and good optics could monitor the property from the surrounding hills without being detected. He needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with, and that meant returning to the cellar to examine his father's Civil War journal more thoroughly. The first reading had revealed the family's involvement in wartime intelligence operations, but there had to be more, something valuable enough to justify murder over a century later. Back in the hidden chamber, Marcus lit the oil lamp again and spread his great-grandfather's military correspondence across the table. Reading more carefully this time, he began to piece together the scope of Jeremiah Stone's wartime activities. The Conde family hadn't just provided safe passage for escaped slaves and Union operatives, they'd been entrusted with some of the most sensitive intelligence operations of the entire conflict. One letter, signed by someone identified only as Colonel H., detailed a mission that made Marcus's blood run cold. Mr. Stone, the package you'll receive contains documents of utmost importance to the Union cause. Confederate agents have infiltrated the highest levels of our government, and traditional channels of communication have been compromised. Your family's proven loyalty and remote location make you our only secure option for preserving this intelligence until it can be safely transmitted to President Lincoln himself. Guard these materials with your life. The outcome of the war may depend on their security. Marcus found the package, referenced in the letter, a sealed oilskin pouch hidden beneath the floorboards of the secret chamber. Inside were documents that made him understand why people were still dying to possess them. Original correspondence between Confederate sympathizers in the Union government and enemy agents. Plans for sabotage operations against Northern infrastructure. Names, dates, and details of treasonous activities that would have changed the course of the war if they'd fallen into the wrong hands. But more disturbing were the modern annotations penciled in the margins notes in Thomas's handwriting, dated just months ago. His brother had been researching the historical figures named in these documents, tracing their family lines and political connections to the present day. Some of the names belonged to families that had gone on to become powerful in politics, business, and society, descendants who would pay handsomely to keep their ancestors' wartime activities buried. Thomas had discovered something that made these century-old secrets relevant to modern times. In a separate notebook, he documented connections between the Confederate sympathizers identified in the wartime correspondence and their living descendants. Senators, Federal judges, business leaders, people with the resources and motivation to kill in order to protect family legacies. One name appeared repeatedly in Thomas's research: Harrison Blackwood III, a federal judge whose great-great-grandfather was prominently featured in the Confederate intelligence documents. According to Thomas's notes, Judge Blackwood had been appointed to the federal bench just 5 years ago, a lifetime appointment that could be threatened by evidence of family treason dating back to the Civil War. Marcus found a more recent entry in Thomas's notebook that made his skin crawl. Blackwood's people contacted me again today. They're offering serious money enough to live comfortably anywhere in the world in exchange for the documents about his ancestor. They claim they only want to preserve family dignity and promise no harm will come to the artifacts. But I've seen what these people do to preserve their secrets. The Morrison family disappeared in 1952 after they started asking questions about Confederate gold. The Hendersons sold their ranch and moved east after someone burned their barn and killed their livestock. I won't be the one to hand over evidence that could exonerate my family's reputation just so some corrupt judge can sleep better at night. The final entry was dated just 1 week before Thomas's death. They've stopped asking nicely. Yesterday I found tire tracks near the north fence line. Someone's been watching the house. Today my mail was clearly opened and resealed. They know Marcus is coming, and they're getting desperate. I've taken precautions, but if something happens to me, I pray my brother will understand the choice I made. Some truths are worth dying for. Marcus closed the notebook with shaking hands. Thomas had known he was going to die, had prepared for it, and had trusted that his brother would carry on the fight. Their family had been waging for over a century. The documents in this chamber weren't just historical artifacts. They were evidence that could clear the Stone family name while destroying powerful people who'd built their careers on lies. But they were also a death sentence for anyone who possessed them, as Thomas had learned too late. The question now was whether Marcus had the courage to finish what his ancestors had started, or whether the Stone family's long tradition of sacrifice would die with him in these mountains. Outside, a vehicle's engine echoed off the valley walls. Marcus extinguished the lamp and listened as multiple trucks approached the house. His unexpected visitors had returned, and this time they weren't being subtle about their intentions. Marcus quickly sealed the hidden chamber and made his way to the cellar stairs, but instead of climbing to the kitchen, he moved toward the back wall, where his great-grandfather's maps had shown an emergency exit. The stone foundation had been carefully constructed with a concealed opening that led to a natural cave system beneath the house. In the darkness, his fingers found the loose stones and pulled them free, revealing a passage just wide enough for a man to crawl through. The vehicles outside had stopped, and he could hear doors slamming and voices calling instructions. At least 4 men, possibly more, coordinating what sounded like a thorough search operation. They weren't being careful about noise anymore, which meant they either didn't care about attracting attention or they'd already eliminated any potential witnesses. Marcus crawled through the narrow passage, following the route his ancestors had used to escape Confederate raiders over a century ago. The cave system opened into a larger chamber about 50 yards from the house, with an exit concealed behind a cluster of boulders on the hillside. From this vantage point, he could observe the house without being detected. 3 black SUVs. They were parked in the driveway, along with a van equipped with what looked like surveillance equipment. The men who'd emerged from the vehicles wore civilian clothes, but moved with military precision. 2 were setting up a perimeter around the house while others prepared to enter. Their leader, a tall man with graying hair and expensive boots, stood near the vehicles, speaking into a satellite phone. Marcus recognized the type, if not the individual private contractors, the kind of men who worked for people with enough money to hire problems solved quietly and permanently. The fact that they'd returned in broad daylight with this much equipment meant they'd decided the situation was urgent enough to risk exposure. From his hiding place, Marcus watched them break into the house with professional efficiency. They knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it. One team headed directly for the kitchen, while another went upstairs to search Thomas's room more thoroughly than they dared during their earlier visit. The third team began a systematic sweep of the ground floor, using electronic devices that probably detected hollow spaces behind walls. The coded map artifact from the hidden chamber suddenly made perfect sense. Marcus pulled out the folded document he'd grabbed before fleeing the cellar, one of the detailed blueprints his great-grandfather had drawn, showing the house's hidden passages and secret compartments. The underground railroad station had been designed not just to hide runaway slaves, but to protect the family and their allies during Confederate raids. Every room had multiple escape routes, and several walls contained concealed storage spaces for documents and supplies. Studying the map more carefully, Marcus realized that Thomas had made modern additions to their ancestors' security measures. Penciled notations showed new hiding places, updated escape routes, and what appeared to be a comprehensive early warning system. His brother had turned the old homestead into a fortress worthy of the secrets it protected. The search team in the kitchen had found the trapdoor to the main cellar. Marcus watched through binoculars as they descended with powerful flashlights, their leader speaking constantly into a radio headset. They spent nearly an hour in the cellar, and when they emerged, their body language suggested frustration. They'd found the journals and maps Marcus had left visible, but they hadn't discovered the hidden chamber behind the bookshelf. The team leader made another call on his satellite phone, this conversation longer and more animated than the first. Marcus couldn't hear the words, but the man's gestures suggested he was reporting failure to someone who wasn't pleased with the news. After ending the call, the leader gathered his men for what looked like a strategy meeting. Marcus used the time to study the escape routes marked on his great-grandfather's map. The cave system he'd used to leave the house connected to a network of natural passages that extended throughout the mountain. Some led to supply caches his ancestors had established, others to observation posts with clear views of the valley approaches. The most intriguing notation showed a route to what Jeremiah Stone had labeled the Sanctuary, a location marked with symbols suggesting it held something of critical importance. The sanctuary was marked 3 miles up the mountain, accessible only through the cave system or by a treacherous hiking trail that would take hours to navigate. According to the map, it contained items too dangerous for the house and provisions for extended isolation. Marcus's ancestors had prepared for the possibility that they might need to abandon the homestead entirely while still protecting their most valuable secrets. Below, the search team was preparing to leave. They'd loaded equipment from the cellar into their van and posted 2 men to watch the house while the others departed. Marcus realized they were setting up a surveillance operation, planning to wait for his return so they could follow him to whatever hiding place they assumed he'd discovered. But they'd made a critical error in their planning. They didn't know about the cave system, which meant Marcus could move through the mountain without being detected. More importantly, they didn't understand that the Stone family had been preparing for exactly this kind of siege for 5 generations. Marcus studied the map's notations about supply caches and defensive positions. His great-grandfather had marked locations where weapons were stored, along with ammunition, food, and water sufficient for a prolonged conflict. The mountain itself had been turned into a fortress, with the house serving as the obvious target, while the real stronghold lay hidden in the peaks above. Thomas's modern additions to the map showed that he'd maintained and updated many of these defensive preparations. Solar panels and battery systems provided power to remote observation posts. Motion sensors and trail cameras monitored approach routes. Hidden radio equipment allowed communication with the outside world. His brother had spent 40 years turning their ancestors' wartime preparations into a sophisticated security network. The implications were staggering. Thomas hadn't just been protecting historical documents, he'd been preparing for a war that he knew would eventually come. The people hunting the Stone family secrets had resources, connections, and the willingness to kill, but they were facing an enemy who'd had over a century to prepare for their arrival. Marcus folded the map and checked his equipment. His mountain survival gear would serve him well in the caves, and his knowledge of the terrain gave him advantages the search team couldn't match. But more than that, he was fighting for something his enemies couldn't understand, a family legacy built on principle rather than profit, sacrifice rather than self-interest. The sun was setting behind the western peaks, and the search team below was settling in for what they expected to be a long wait. They'd positioned themselves to watch the obvious approaches to the house, confident that their target would eventually return to claim whatever he'd found in the cellar. They were right about his return, but wrong about everything else. Marcus Stone was about to discover that some family traditions were worth killing for, and that the skills his ancestors had used to fight Confederate raiders translated perfectly to dealing with modern enemies who threatened everything the Stone family had spent generations protecting. The war for his family's legacy was about to begin, and this time Marcus intended to finish it. The cave system proved even more extensive than Jeremiah Stone's maps had indicated. Marcus followed the main passage for nearly a mile, moving by flashlight through corridors carved by centuries of mountain water flow. His ancestors had improved the natural caves with wooden supports and stone steps where needed, creating a hidden highway through the heart of the mountain. At regular intervals, Marcus found evidence of Thomas's maintenance work, fresh timber supports, modern lighting systems powered by concealed solar panels, and supply caches stocked with contemporary survival gear. His brother had transformed their great-grandfather's emergency escape route into a sophisticated base of operations. The first major supply cache was located in a large chamber marked on the map as Station Alpha. Inside waterproof containers, Marcus found military-grade equipment that suggested Thomas's preparations had been far more serious than simple historical preservation. Night vision goggles, encrypted radios, detailed topographical maps of the entire region, and weapons that definitely weren't Civil War antiques. But it was the documents in a sealed briefcase that made Marcus understand the true scope of what Thomas had been facing. His brother hadn't just been dealing with treasure hunters or amateur historians. He'd been under surveillance by a network that included government officials, private security contractors, and what appeared to be elements within federal law enforcement itself. The briefcase contained Thomas's correspondence with legitimate historians and government archivists, people who'd been trying to help him find a legal way to preserve the family's historical documents while protecting them from exploitation. But those same letters revealed how the information had leaked to hostile parties. Someone within the official channels had been feeding intelligence to Judge Blackwood's people, allowing them to stay one step ahead of any legal protections Thomas might have arranged. A letter from Dr. Sarah Chen, a historian at the Smithsonian Institution, dated just 3 months before Thomas's death, painted a disturbing picture. "Mr. Stone, I must warn you that our previous correspondence may have been compromised. Yesterday, I was contacted by a federal marshal asking detailed questions about our discussions regarding your family's Civil War documents. The marshal claimed to be investigating potential fraud, but his questions focused specifically on the location and contents of your archives rather than their authenticity. I fear that people with official authority may be working against your interests. I recommend you cease all communication through normal channels until we can establish secure methods of contact." Thomas's handwritten response, found in draft form, showed his growing desperation. "Dr. Chen, your warning comes too late. They've been watching the house for weeks, and yesterday I found evidence that my phone and mail have been compromised. I'm taking steps to protect the most important documents, but I fear my time is running out. If something happens to me, please remember that my family's reputation depends on these materials being preserved and properly presented to history. We were patriots, not traitors, regardless of what lies have been spread about us." The final document in the briefcase was Thomas's confession letter, the artifact that would redefine everything Marcus thought he knew about his brother's motivations and sacrifices. The letter was addressed to Marcus personally, written in Thomas's careful handwriting, but with the urgency of a man who knew he might not live to deliver it in person. Marcus, if you're reading this, then they finally decided the risk of leaving me alive was too great. I want you to know that everything that happened between us 40 years ago was my choice, not yours. I drove you away because I knew what protecting this secret would cost, and I couldn't bear the thought of watching it destroy your life the way it destroyed mine. Father told me about the documents when I turned 18, the same age you were when we had our fight. He explained that someone from the family had to stay and guard what our ancestors died to protect. I volunteered because I was the younger son, because you had dreams of seeing the world beyond these mountains, and because I loved you enough to let you hate me rather than chain you to this burden. I spent 40 years watching for the people who would eventually come for our secrets. I learned everything I could about modern surveillance, personal security, and the kinds of enemies our family legacy would attract. I turned myself into a soldier because I knew that someday I'd have to fight a war our great-grandfather had started but never finished. The people hunting us aren't just treasure seekers or amateur historians. They're part of a network that includes some of the most powerful families in America, descendants of the Confederate sympathizers our ancestors exposed during the war. They've spent generations building wealth and influence while hiding their treasonous heritage. The documents in our cellar could destroy political careers, end judicial appointments, and bankrupt families who've profited from their ancestors' betrayal. But more than that, these documents prove that the Stone family were heroes, not villains. Every lie that's been told about us, every rumor of Confederate gold or Southern sympathies can be disproven by the evidence our great-grandfather preserved. We have proof that our family helped win the Civil War, that we sacrificed everything for the cause of freedom, and that we died defending the Union against its internal enemies. I couldn't bear the thought of you spending your life the way I've spent mine, isolated, paranoid, always waiting for the next threat. So I made the choice our great-grandfather made when he drove away his eldest son to protect him from the treasure hunters. I let you go so you could have the life I never could. But now the choice is yours, brother. You can take what you've learned and disappear again. Let the Stone family secrets die with the last generation that remembers them. Or you can finish what our ancestors started, clear our family name, and make sure the truth survives to honor those who died protecting it. I won't blame you for whatever choice you make. You've already given enough years to our family's isolation. But if you decide to fight, know that I've spent 4 decades preparing for this moment. Every weapon, every escape route, every hiding place has been chosen with this day in mind. You won't be facing our enemies alone. You'll have the accumulated wisdom and preparation of 5 generations of Stone family resistance. The sanctuary marked on Father's map contains everything you'll need to win this war or disappear forever. The choice, for the first time in Stone family history, is entirely yours. Your brother, who never stopped loving you despite the necessary lies, Thomas Marcus, read the letter 3 times before the full impact hit him. 40 years of anger and resentment crumbled like a dam broken by spring floods. Thomas hadn't driven him away out of pride or family politics. He'd sacrificed his own happiness to give Marcus the freedom their ancestors had never enjoyed. Every harsh word, every cold rejection, every year of silence had been motivated by love rather than hatred. The guilt was crushing, but it was accompanied by something else, a burning determination to justify Thomas's sacrifice by finishing what their family had started. The Stone name would be cleared, their ancestors' heroism would be recognized, and the corrupt officials who'd profited from historical lies would face justice. But first, Marcus had to reach the sanctuary and discover what final gifts Thomas had left for him. The war for their family's legacy was about to escalate, and Marcus Stone was finally ready to fight it with everything his ancestors had taught him about courage, sacrifice, and the price of freedom. The path to the sanctuary led deeper into the mountain than Marcus had ever explored, following cave passages that eventually opened onto a concealed trail carved into the cliff face. Thomas's improvements were evident everywhere. Steel cables anchored into the rock for safety, solar-powered LED markers visible only from the correct angle, and supply caches positioned at strategic intervals for anyone making the dangerous journey. The trail emerged onto a hidden plateau, surrounded by towering peaks, invisible from the valley below, and accessible only through the cave system or by an extremely hazardous climb that would challenge even experienced mountaineers. In the center of the plateau stood a structure that took Marcus's breath away, a fortress built into the living rock, camouflaged so perfectly that it seemed like a natural formation until examined closely. The sanctuary was far more than the simple hideout Marcus had expected. Thomas had spent decades expanding on their ancestors' original refuge, creating a completely self-sufficient stronghold that could withstand a prolonged siege. Solar panels disguised as rock outcroppings provided power, while an artesian spring supplied fresh water. Gardens terraced into the mountainside grew vegetables protected by the plateau's unique microclimate. Inside, the sanctuary revealed the full scope of Thomas's preparation and obsession. The main room had been carved from solid granite and reinforced with steel beams, creating a space large enough to house a small library, workshop, and living quarters. But it was the walls that told the story of Thomas's 40-year mission. Every surface was covered with maps, photographs, newspaper clippings, and genealogical charts tracking the descendants of the Confederate sympathizers identified in their great-grandfathers' documents. Marcus found himself staring at what amounted to a war room dedicated to a conflict that had been raging in secret for over a century. Thomas had documented not just the historical crimes committed by Confederate agents during the war, but how their families had used stolen intelligence and Union military secrets to build post-war fortunes. Names connected by red thread showed marriages, business partnerships, and political alliances that had created a network of power spanning generations. The centerpiece of the display was a detailed family tree for Judge Harrison Blackwood III. Thomas had traced the judge's lineage back to Major Harrison Blackwood, one of the most dangerous Confederate spies mentioned in their great-grandfather's documents. The modern judge's appointment to the federal bench, his decisions in cases involving Civil War historical sites, and his connections to other descendants of Confederate agents painted a picture of coordinated effort to suppress inconvenient historical truths. But Thomas had discovered something far more disturbing than simple historical cover-ups. In a locked filing cabinet, Marcus found evidence that the network of descendants had been actively working to rewrite Civil War history for decades. They'd funded pseudo-historical research, influenced textbook publishers, and even arranged for the destruction of archives that contradicted their preferred narratives. The Stone family documents weren't just embarrassing, they were evidence of a coordinated campaign to falsify American history for the benefit of traitors' descendants. The survivor's testament artifact emerged from these files like a smoking gun. Thomas had located Rebecca Williams, a 93-year-old woman living in a Denver nursing home, whose great-grandmother had been among the last people saved by the Stone family's underground railroad station. Rebecca had inherited not just family stories, but original documents, letters, photographs, and testimonies that corroborated everything in the Stone family archives. Thomas's interview notes with Rebecca painted a picture of systematic intimidation spanning generations. Mrs. Williams confirmed that her family maintained contact with other Underground Railroad survivors well into the 20th century. They formed an informal network, sharing stories and preserving evidence of their experiences. But beginning in the 1922, members of this network began experiencing mysterious problems, fires that destroyed family archives, burglaries that targeted only historical documents, and pressure from lawyers representing historical preservation societies offering to buy their materials. Mrs. Williams's family resisted these pressures until 1963, when her grandfather received a visit from men claiming to represent federal authorities. They confiscated several boxes of documents under what they claimed was the authority of national security laws. When her grandfather requested legal representation, he was told that challenging the seizure would result in investigation of his entire family for possible subversive activities. The intimidation worked for 40 years, but Mrs. Williams decided to break her family's silence when she learned about the planned development of a Civil War memorial park on land that had once been a major underground railroad site. The memorial was being funded by the Blackwood Foundation and designed to honor all Americans who served their conscience during the national crisis, language that would allow Confederate sympathizers to be remembered as patriots alongside genuine heroes. Mrs. Williams provided copies of her great-grandmother's testimony about the Stone family's heroism, along with photographs and documents that prove the Underground Railroad network was far more extensive and effective than official histories acknowledge. She also confirmed that other survivor families have similar evidence but remain too frightened to come forward. Marcus found Thomas's final notes on the Rebecca Williams interview, written just days before his death. Mrs. Williams passed away yesterday in her sleep. Natural causes, according to the nursing home, but the timing troubles me. I'd arranged to meet with her granddaughter next week to transfer additional documents, but when I called today, I learned that the family had suddenly decided to donate all of their historical materials to the Blackwood Foundation for proper preservation. The granddaughter claimed it was Mrs. Williams's dying wish, but her voice suggested she was reading from a script. I'm the last person alive who knows the full scope of what our families preserved. If something happens to me, these testimonies and documents will disappear into private collections where they can be suppressed or destroyed. The Stone family legacy will die with me unless Marcus chooses to carry it forward. The weight of being the last guardian of this historical truth settled on Marcus like mountain snow, heavy, cold, and inescapable. But alongside the burden came something else, the tools Thomas had prepared for exactly this moment. Hidden behind a false wall, Marcus discovered Thomas's masterpiece, a complete digital archive of every document, photograph, and testimony their family had preserved. Multiple copies stored on encrypted drives, with instructions for securely transmitting the information to legitimate historians, journalists, and government officials who couldn't be bought or intimidated. But Thomas had also prepared for the possibility that legal channels might fail. A second set of files contained evidence of the modern crimes committed to suppress historical truth documentation of Rebecca Williams's suspicious death, records of other survivors who'd been intimidated into silence, and financial records showing how the Blackwood network had funded decades of historical falsification. The sanctuary wasn't just a hideout, it was a command center for a final battle that would either vindicate the Stone family's century of sacrifice or see their secrets buried forever with the last man willing to die, protecting them. Marcus stood surrounded by his brother's life's work, finally understanding the magnitude of what Thomas had preserved and prepared. The choice was no longer whether to fight, but how to ensure that when the battle was over, truth would triumph over the lies that had poisoned American history for generations. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the peaks, and Marcus could see lights moving in the valley below. His enemies were expanding their search, closing in on the sanctuary that had protected Stone family secrets for 5 generations. The final confrontation was coming, and this time Marcus intended to finish what his ancestors had started. Marcus was examining Thomas's digital archive when he noticed something that made his blood freeze. Hidden among the surveillance equipment in the sanctuary's storage room were devices he didn't recognize. Small, sophisticated electronics that didn't match anything else Thomas had installed. They looked newer, more advanced, and they were positioned to monitor the sanctuary itself rather than the approaches to it. Working by flashlight to avoid activating any motion sensors, Marcus carefully examined the foreign equipment. What he found confirmed his worst fears. Someone had been inside the sanctuary recently, installing modern surveillance gear that was actively transmitting data. The sanctuary wasn't a secret refuge, it was a trap that had been compromised for months, possibly years. But by whom? Thomas's security measures should have made it impossible for outsiders to reach the plateau, let alone penetrate the fortress itself. The answer came when Marcus found a hidden panel behind Thomas's workstation that contained equipment he'd never seen before, and a letter in his brother's handwriting that explained everything. Marcus, if you're reading this, then you've discovered the surveillance equipment I was forced to install. I'm sorry, brother, but I had no choice. They have something more valuable to me than my life, and they've made it clear that cooperation is the only way to protect what matters most. They have Sarah. I never told you about her because I knew you'd try to talk me out of the isolation I thought was necessary. But 5 years ago, I met Dr. Sarah Chen when she first contacted me about the family documents. What started as professional correspondence became something more. We fell in love through letters and secure phone calls, and eventually she convinced me that I didn't have to spend my life alone protecting our secrets. Sarah is brilliant, dedicated to historical truth, and brave enough to help me find a legal way to preserve our family's legacy while clearing our name. She's also the only person I've trusted with the full scope of what we're protecting. That trust nearly got her killed. 3 months ago, Sarah was kidnapped from her apartment in Washington. No ransom demand, no official investigation, nothing to suggest she'd simply disappeared. But I received a call from Judge Blackwood himself the next day. He knew about our relationship, our correspondence, everything we'd planned. He also knew exactly where Sarah was being held and what would happen to her if I didn't cooperate. The deal was simple. I would allow his people to install monitoring equipment in the sanctuary and provide them with copies of selected documents, enough to satisfy their immediate concerns, but not enough to expose the full scope of their network's crimes. In exchange, Sarah would remain safe but under their control until the situation was resolved to everyone's satisfaction. I agreed because I had no choice, but I also began planning for this moment when you would arrive and discover what I'd been forced to do. The surveillance equipment they installed is real and functional, but I've modified it to serve our purposes rather than theirs. Every conversation they've recorded, every document they think they've seen, has been carefully crafted to mislead them about our true capabilities. They believe the sanctuary contains the originals of our most dangerous documents, when in fact everything they've observed here consists of carefully prepared copies and decoys. The real evidence, the materials that could destroy their network permanently, remains hidden in locations they've never discovered. More importantly, their surveillance equipment has been recording their own conversations and transmitting that intelligence back to contacts I've established within legitimate federal agencies. For months, they've been providing evidence of their own crimes while believing they were spying on us. But Sarah is still their prisoner, and freeing her will require exposing myself to dangers I can't face alone. I've tried to ransom her freedom by offering to disappear permanently with copies of our least damaging documents, but they've refused every proposal. They want complete control over our family's legacy, and they're willing to commit any crime necessary to achieve it. If something happens to me before you arrive, you'll find everything you need to locate and rescue Sarah in the sealed compartment behind this letter. But know that attempting her rescue will trigger the final confrontation our family has been preparing for since the Civil War. Once you act against them, there will be no going back, no possibility of negotiated settlement or peaceful resolution. They've made this a war, Marcus, and wars end only when one side surrenders or dies. Choose carefully, But remember that Sarah knows everything about our family's true history. Her freedom isn't just a matter of love, it's essential for ensuring that our ancestors' sacrifices will be honored by history rather than buried by lies. Your brother, who loves both you and the woman who taught him that love was worth any risk. Thomas Marcus's hands shook as he opened the sealed compartment and found detailed intelligence about Sarah's captivity. Thomas had spent months planning her rescue, gathering information about her location, her guards, and the security measures protecting her prison. The files contained floor plans, guard rotations, communication intercepts, and escape routes that read like a military operation rather than a simple rescue attempt. Dr. Sarah Chen was being held at a private compound in the mountains 50 miles north of the Stone Homestead, a facility ostensibly operated by a security consulting firm but actually controlled by the Blackwood network. The compound housed what appeared to be a private intelligence operation, complete with detention facilities, interrogation rooms, and communication equipment capable of monitoring federal law enforcement agencies. But the most shocking revelation was contained in transcripts of conversations Thomas had recorded using the modified surveillance equipment. Judge Blackwood wasn't just protecting his family's reputation, he was actively using his federal position to suppress historical evidence and eliminate anyone who threatened the network's interests. Sarah's kidnapping was only the latest in a series of crimes that included murder, blackmail, and the systematic corruption of historical research institutions. The recordings revealed that Thomas's death hadn't been a simple poisoning. It had been carried out by a federal marshal working directly for Judge Blackwood, using his official authority to gain access to the house and administer a lethal injection disguised as a routine medical emergency. The same marshal was now leading the search for Marcus, operating under false federal warrants that gave him authority to kill anyone who resisted. Marcus realized he was facing enemies who had infiltrated law enforcement at the highest levels, who could issue false federal orders and eliminate witnesses with complete impunity. But Thomas had also given him something invaluable evidence of their crimes recorded in their own voices, documented with the kind of detail that could destroy the entire network if it reached the right people. The modified surveillance equipment that had seemed like a betrayal was actually Thomas's masterpiece, a system that had been feeding the Blackwood network false information while recording genuine evidence of their conspiracy. Every conversation, every criminal order, every detail of their operation had been preserved with legal quality documentation that could convict them all. But Sarah was still their prisoner, and the recordings meant nothing if Marcus couldn't survive long enough to deliver them to authorities who weren't corrupted by the network's influence. The rescue operation Thomas had planned was complex and dangerous, requiring skills Marcus had developed during 40 years of mountain survival, but had never applied to combat against human enemies. Outside, Marcus could see lights moving through the valley in patterns that suggested a coordinated search operation. The corrupt marshal and his team were closing in on the sanctuary, probably guided by intelligence from the surveillance equipment they believed was still serving their interests. They expected to find Marcus trapped in his family's last refuge, unaware that Thomas had turned their own tools against them. But they were also holding an innocent woman whose only crime was falling in love with a man devoted to historical truth. Sarah's rescue would require Marcus to leave the relative safety of the sanctuary and venture into enemy territory, where his mountain skills would be matched against professional killers with federal authority to eliminate anyone who interfered with their mission. The choice Thomas had warned him about was no longer theoretical. Marcus could take the evidence and disappear into the mountains, letting Sarah die but preserving the materials needed to eventually expose the conspiracy. Or he could attempt her rescue, risking everything his family had died to protect for the chance to save one woman who represented hope for a future beyond the cycle of secrecy and sacrifice that had defined Stone family history. Marcus looked at the photograph Thomas had included in the rescue files, a picture of Dr. Sarah Chen, smiling in front of the Smithsonian Institution, her eyes bright with intelligence and passion for the historical truth she'd devoted her life to preserving. She represented everything the Stone family had fought for across 5 generations, and she was in danger because she'd chosen to help them complete their mission. The decision was easier than Marcus had expected. He began gathering the equipment he'd need for the most important mission of his life. One that would either end the Stone family's long war with victory and vindication, or see their secrets buried forever along with the last man willing to die protecting them. Marcus spent the next several hours studying Thomas's rescue plan with the methodical intensity of a man whose life would depend on understanding every detail. The Emergency Protocol Manual, Thomas's comprehensive guide for the operation, read like a military field manual, combined with 40 years of mountain warfare experience. Every contingency had been considered, every risk calculated, every piece of equipment selected for maximum effectiveness in Rocky Mountain terrain. The compound holding Sarah was built into a mountainside 47 miles north of the sanctuary, accessible only by a single mountain road that wound through 3 security checkpoints. Thomas had spent months conducting reconnaissance, using his knowledge of the mountain cave systems to observe the facility without detection. His notes revealed a sophisticated operation that went far beyond simple kidnapping. The Blackwood network had constructed what amounted to a private intelligence agency, complete with holding facilities for assets who possessed information they wanted to control. Sarah wasn't their only prisoner. The compound housed at least 6 other people, including historians, journalists, and government employees who'd discovered inconvenient truths about powerful families. Some had been there for years, disappeared from their lives with cover stories about research sabbaticals or family emergencies. Thomas's intelligence files painted a picture of systematic suppression that extended far beyond Civil War history. The network had been manipulating historical narratives, silencing researchers, and even arranging accidents for people who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Sarah's kidnapping was part of a larger pattern of crimes that had been ongoing for decades, protected by the network's infiltration of federal law enforcement and intelligence agencies. The rescue plan Thomas had developed was ambitious and dangerous, relying on Marcus's mountain skills and the element of surprise. The compound's security was designed to repel conventional assault, but hadn't anticipated an attack from someone who could navigate the treacherous mountain terrain surrounding the facility. Thomas had identified a route that would allow Marcus to approach undetected, but it required traversing some of the most dangerous climbing terrain in the Rockies. Marcus checked his equipment against Thomas's specifications. His brother had cached everything needed for the mission in a hidden armory within the sanctuary: military-grade climbing gear, night vision equipment, weapons selected for stealth and reliability, and communication devices that could penetrate the compound's electronic interference. Thomas had even included detailed maps of the facility's interior, obtained through what appeared to be infiltration by allies Marcus didn't know his brother possessed. The most sobering part of the manual was Thomas's assessment of the mission's likely outcome. Even with perfect execution, the rescue would almost certainly trigger a violent response that would put both Marcus and Sarah in mortal danger. The corrupt federal marshal leading the hunt for the Stone family secrets had authorization to kill anyone who interfered with their operation, and the compound's guards were former military contractors with orders to eliminate any threats to their prisoners. But Thomas had also prepared for the aftermath of the rescue attempt. Hidden within the sanctuary's communication systems was an automatic transmission protocol that would activate if Marcus failed to check in within 72 hours. The entire digital archive, every document, recording, and piece of evidence their family had preserved would be simultaneously transmitted to dozens of news organizations, historical institutions, and honest federal officials who had the authority and motivation to act on the information. The dead man switch meant that killing Marcus would only accelerate the exposure of the conspiracy rather than ending it. Thomas had ensured that their family's truth would survive, even if the last stone guardian died protecting it. But Marcus understood that the price of triggering that protocol would be Sarah's life, along with the lives of every other prisoner held at the compound. Marcus spent his final hours of preparation reviewing Thomas's notes about the woman he'd fallen in love with through their correspondence. Dr. Sarah Chen wasn't just a brilliant historian. She was someone who dedicated her life to ensuring that America's real heroes were remembered while its hidden villains were exposed. Her research into Civil War intelligence operations had led her to contact Thomas, and her passion for historical truth had convinced him that their family's long isolation might finally end. Thomas's letters to Sarah, copies of which he'd saved in the protocol manual, revealed a man transformed by love and hope after 40 years of lonely determination. For the first time since their childhood, Thomas had allowed himself to believe that the Stone family legacy might be preserved without requiring another generation of sacrifice and secrecy. Sarah represented not just personal happiness, but the possibility of a future where their ancestors' heroism could be celebrated openly, rather than hidden from enemies who would use truth as a weapon. The compound's location required Marcus to traverse nearly 50 miles of mountain wilderness in complete darkness, following routes that existed more as theoretical possibilities than established trails. Thomas's maps showed a path through cave systems and along cliff faces that would challenge even experienced climbers under ideal conditions. But the route was also invisible to satellite surveillance and electronic monitoring, allowing Marcus to approach the facility without triggering the early warning systems that protected the compound's obvious approaches. Marcus began his descent from the sanctuary at sunset, carrying equipment that represented the accumulated wisdom of 5 generations of Stone family resistance. His great-grandfather's maps had been updated with modern GPS coordinates and satellite imagery. Civil War-era escape routes had been improved with contemporary climbing techniques and equipment. Thomas's 40 years of preparation had created a perfect fusion of historical knowledge and modern capability. The first leg of the journey led through familiar territory, cave systems Marcus had explored during his reconnaissance of the sanctuary. But as he moved north toward the compound, the terrain became increasingly treacherous. Thomas's route followed natural features that provided concealment but demanded expert mountaineering skills to navigate safely. By midnight, Marcus had covered half the distance to the compound, moving through terrain that would have been impassable without Thomas's detailed route descriptions and the specialized equipment his brother had provided. The night vision goggles revealed a landscape of vertical rock faces and narrow ledges that tested every skill Marcus had learned during 40 years of mountain living. The most dangerous section of the approach began at 3 a.m. when Marcus reached what Thomas had labeled the Traverse, a series of cliff faces that required technical climbing with no margin for error. A fall here wouldn't just end the rescue mission, it would trigger the automatic transmission protocol and guarantee Sarah's death, along with Marcus's own. But Thomas's route notes included anchor points and safety lines he'd pre-positioned during his reconnaissance, turning an impossible climb into merely a deadly one. Marcus clipped into Thomas's safety system and began the traverse, moving by feel and instinct across rock faces that dropped into darkness. Every handhold had been tested by his brother, every anchor point secured with the kind of attention to detail that separated successful operations from tragic failures. Thomas had climbed this route multiple times, perfecting the approach and preparing backup options for every section where weather or equipment failure might trap a climber. As dawn approached, Marcus reached the final observation point Thomas had established, overlooking the compound. Through military-grade binoculars, he could see the facility that had been Dr. Sarah Chen's prison for 3 months, a complex of buildings carved into the mountainside and surrounded by security measures that would have challenged a military assault team. But Thomas's intelligence was accurate and current. The guard rotations followed predictable patterns, the electronic surveillance had blind spots that could be exploited, and the compound's builders had never anticipated an attack from someone who understood mountain warfare better than they understood conventional security. The rescue was possible, but it would require perfect timing and the kind of desperate courage that had defined Stone family history for over a century. Marcus checked his watch and began the final preparations for an assault that would either end his family's long war with victory or see their legacy buried forever in the mountains that had protected their secrets for 5 generations. In 6 hours, he would discover whether Thomas's love for Dr. Sarah Chen had been strong enough to overcome the enemies who'd spent a century silencing anyone who threatened their lives. The final battle for the Stone family legacy was about to begin, and this time Marcus intended to ensure that truth triumphed over the corruption that had poisoned American history for too long. The master cache location artifact emerged from its hiding place like the final piece of a puzzle Marcus hadn't known he was solving. Hidden beneath a false bottom in Thomas's observation post was a map that revealed the true scope of their family's century-long preparation for this moment. The compound holding Sarah wasn't just a prison, it was built directly above the most important underground railroad cache their ancestors had ever established. According to the map, Jeremiah Stone had hidden the most dangerous documents in a cave system beneath what was now the Blackwood compound. The irony was staggering. Judge Blackwood's network had unknowingly built their headquarters on top of the very evidence that could destroy them. But accessing the cache would require Marcus to penetrate not just the compound's security, but the mountain itself, following routes that hadn't been used since the Civil War. Thomas's notes revealed why he'd never attempted to retrieve these ultimate secrets himself. The cave entrance was located inside the compound's maximum security section, accessible only through the building where Sarah and the other prisoners were being held. Any rescue attempt would necessarily expose the master cache, turning the mission from a simple extraction into a race to secure the most damaging evidence their family had ever preserved. Marcus studied the infiltration route Thomas had planned, understanding now why his brother had spent months preparing for this single operation. The compound's builders had unknowingly sealed the historical cave entrance when they constructed their facility. But Thomas had identified structural weaknesses that could be exploited by someone with his engineering knowledge and Marcus's climbing skills. The plan was elegant, dangerous, and required split-second timing to succeed. At dawn, Marcus began his descent toward the compound's outer perimeter. The facility sprawled across a natural shelf in the mountainside, protected by electronic sensors and human guards who rotated in patterns Thomas had memorized during months of observation. The compound consisted of 3 main buildings connected by covered walkways, an administration center, a communications facility, and the detention block where Sarah was being held. Marcus's approach route led through a narrow ravine that provided concealment until the final 50 yards, where he would be exposed to observation from 2 guard towers. Thomas's plan called for a diversion at exactly 7:15 a.m., when the corrupt federal marshal always conducted his morning briefing with the compound's security chief. Marcus had 12 minutes to cross the exposed ground, penetrate the detention building, and reach Sarah's cell before the diversion ended and normal security procedures resumed. The timing proved flawless. As Marcus emerged from the ravine, he could see the security personnel gathered around the administration building, their attention focused on the briefing rather than the perimeter. Thomas's intelligence about guard rotations and facility procedures was accurate to the minute, allowing Marcus to reach the detention building's ventilation system exactly as planned. The building's construction incorporated the natural cave system, with several cells carved directly into the mountain's bedrock. Thomas had identified structural modifications that would allow access to the original underground railroad passages, but only from inside the maximum security area where the most important prisoners were held. Sarah's cell was located in this section, along with 5 other people whose research had threatened the Blackwood Network's interests. Marcus navigated the building's ventilation system using blueprints Thomas had somehow obtained, moving through ductwork that led directly to the cell block. The facility's designers had assumed that anyone reaching this point would be a conventional infiltrator, not someone who understood the mountain's hidden geography better than they understood their own security measures. Sarah's cell was exactly where Thomas's intelligence had indicated a converted cave chamber with reinforced bars, but original stone walls that connected to the underground railroad passages. Marcus could hear voices from the corridor outside, guards conducting their routine prisoner check, but the ventilation system provided perfect concealment for his approach. When he quietly removed the ventilation grate and dropped into Sarah's cell, Marcus found himself face to face with the woman his brother had died trying to protect. Dr. Sarah Chen was smaller than he'd expected, but carried herself with the dignity of someone who refused to be broken by captivity. Her eyes showed surprise at his arrival, but no fear. Thomas had apparently prepared her for the possibility of rescue. "You're Marcus," she whispered, recognizing him from photographs Thomas had shared. "Thomas said you'd come. Are you ready for what we're going to find down there?" She gestured toward a section of the cell's stone wall that looked different from the rest, older, with markings that suggested it concealed the entrance to the underground railroad cache. Marcus realized that Sarah had spent her 3 months of captivity, not just surviving but exploring, discovering the historical significance of her prison and preparing for this moment. "The other prisoners know about the plan," Sarah continued quietly. "We're ready to move when you are. But Marcus, what we're about to uncover is going to change everything. The documents down there don't just clear your family's name. They prove that some of the most powerful families in America built their fortunes on treason and murder." The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor meant their window for action was closing rapidly. Marcus began working on the concealed entrance Sarah had identified, understanding that the next few minutes would determine whether 5 generations of Stone family sacrifice would finally achieve justice or end in tragedy beneath the mountains that had protected their secrets for so long. The concealed entrance opened onto a passage that had been sealed for over a century, revealing the original Emancipation Draft's artifact that would rewrite American Civil War history. Marcus and Sarah descended into the underground railroad cache as alarm bells began sounding throughout the compound above. Their rescue had been discovered, but they were now in territory that belonged to the Stone family rather than their enemies. The cache chamber was vast, carved from living rock and preserved by the mountain's natural climate control. But what took Marcus's breath away wasn't the size of the space. It was the carefully organized archive that represented the true prize the Blackwood Network had been seeking for generations. Thomas's intelligence had been incomplete. This wasn't just a hiding place for dangerous documents. It was the secret archive of Union intelligence operations, containing original materials that could redefine understanding of how the Civil War was actually won. At the center of the chamber, Sarah led Marcus to a climate-controlled case that contained documents bearing the unmistakable handwriting of Abraham Lincoln himself. These weren't copies or transcripts, they were original drafts of the Emancipation Proclamation, including versions that revealed the political calculations and moral struggles behind the decision to free the slaves. More shocking were Lincoln's personal notes about Confederate agents within his own administration, including detailed plans for post-war justice that had never been implemented. "Thomas was right," Sarah whispered as they examined the documents by flashlight. "These papers prove that Lincoln knew exactly who the traitors were and planned to prosecute them after the war. The assassination wasn't just about Confederate revenge, it was about preventing war crimes trials that would have destroyed some of America's most prominent families." The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the mountain passages above them. The compound security forces were attempting to follow them into the underground railroad system, but Marcus had advantages they couldn't match. He knew these mountains, understood how the cave systems connected, and had been prepared for exactly this moment by 40 years of wilderness survival and Thomas's detailed planning. Marcus gathered the most critical documents, while Sarah helped liberate the other prisoners who'd been held in the facility. Dr. James Morrison, a historian who disappeared 2 years earlier while researching Civil War financial records. Professor Elena Rodriguez, a genealogist whose work had threatened several powerful political families. 3 other researchers whose investigations had been too thorough for the Blackwood Network's comfort. "We need to split up," Marcus told the group as they reached a junction in the cave system. "Sarah and I will secure the evidence and establish communication with the outside world. The rest of you follow the main passage. It leads to an exit 3 miles down the mountain. There's a ranger station where you can get help." The liberated prisoners disappeared into the mountain's depths, following routes that Jeremiah Stone had marked for escaping slaves over a century ago. Marcus and Sarah took a different path, one that led to the communication equipment Thomas had hidden throughout the mountain system. The evidence they carried needed to reach the outside world before their enemies could silence them permanently. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. The corrupt federal marshal had entered the cave system with a tactical team, using military equipment to track their quarry through the underground railroad passages. But they were hunting in territory that favored defenders who understood its geography, following routes that had been designed to confuse and delay pursuers while protecting those who knew the mountain's secrets. Marcus led Sarah through a maze of passages that connected to the natural cave system, extending throughout the Rocky Mountain region. Thomas's preparation had included backup routes, supply caches, and communication points that could support an extended campaign if necessary. The Stone family's century of preparation was finally being tested against enemies who represented everything their ancestors had fought to defeat. At a hidden communication station, Marcus activated the transmission protocol Thomas had prepared for this moment. The original emancipation drafts, along with the complete digital archive of Stone family evidence, began uploading to secure servers maintained by legitimate government agencies and historical institutions. Within hours, every major news organization in America would have proof of the conspiracy that had been suppressing historical truth for generations. But the upload would take time to complete, and their enemies were closing in with murderous intent. The corrupt marshal's tactical team had superior weapons and training, while Marcus and Sarah had only the advantages of terrain and the desperate courage of people fighting for something larger than their own survival. The final confrontation erupted in the main underground railroad chamber, where 5 generations of Stone family resistance met the descendants of the Confederate agents they'd spent their lives opposing. Marcus used every skill his mountain life had taught him, turning the cave system into a fortress that protected the evidence, while ensuring that his family's long war would finally end with justice rather than silence. When the shooting stopped and the mountain passages fell quiet, Marcus and Sarah emerged into daylight, carrying proof that would vindicate the Stone family legacy while destroying the corrupt network that had murdered Thomas and countless others who'd threatened their lives. The Stone family's war was over, and this time truth had triumphed over the forces that had tried to bury it in darkness. 6 months after the confrontation in the Underground Railroad chambers, Marcus Stone stood on the porch of the family homestead, watching the first busload of visitors arrive for the grand opening of the Stone Family Legacy Foundation. The old house had been restored to its Civil War-era appearance, but with modern amenities that would allow it to serve as both a museum and research center dedicated to preserving the true history of the Underground Railroad and Union intelligence operations. The transformation had been remarkable. What had begun as a desperate fight to clear his family's name had evolved into a national story that changed how Americans understood their Civil War heritage. The original emancipation drafts and Lincoln's intelligence files had provided evidence that revolutionized academic understanding of the conflict while the exposure of the Blackwood conspiracy had triggered investigations that reached into the highest levels of government and society. Judge Harrison Blackwood III had been removed from the federal bench and faced trial for conspiracy, murder, and the systematic suppression of historical evidence. The corrupt federal marshal who'd killed Thomas was in federal prison, along with dozens of other co-conspirators who'd spent decades silencing anyone who threatened their version of history. But the most satisfying outcome for Marcus was the public vindication of his family's reputation. The Family Legacy Foundation Charter artifact sat framed on the wall of what had once been Thomas's bedroom, now converted into the Foundation's administrative center. The document established a permanent organization dedicated to preserving Underground Railroad history, supporting researchers who investigated suppressed historical truths, and ensuring that families like the Stones, who'd sacrificed everything for principle, would be remembered for their courage rather than persecuted for their secrets. Dr. Sarah Chen had become the Foundation's director, bringing her expertise in Civil War history and her passion for historical justice to the task of creating something positive from the tragedy that had brought them together. Marcus watched her now through the window, leading a tour group through the restored Underground Railroad stations and explaining how the Stone family had risked everything to help others find freedom. Their relationship had grown slowly, built on shared commitment to honoring Thomas's memory and ensuring that the Stone family's long sacrifice had achieved lasting meaning. Sarah understood the weight of the legacy Marcus had inherited, just as he understood her dedication to historical truth. They'd found in each other the possibility of a future that honored the past while moving beyond the isolation and secrecy that had defined previous generations. The visitor center housed displays that told the complete story of the Underground Railroad network, the Union intelligence operations, and the Stone family's role in both. School children from across Colorado came to learn about ordinary Americans who'd chosen courage over comfort, principle over profit. College students researched their own family histories, discovering that heroism often existed in places historians had never thought to look. But perhaps the most meaningful visitors were the descendants of people the Stone family had helped escape slavery. The Foundation had located dozens of families whose ancestors had found freedom through the Rocky Mountain Underground Railroad network. They came to honor not just the Stone family, but all the unsung heroes who'd made their freedom possible, creating connections across time that transformed historical scholarship into personal testimony. Marcus had chosen to stay at the homestead rather than return to his mountain cabin, accepting the role of caretaker for his family's legacy. The isolation he'd once craved had been replaced by purposeful connection with visitors who came to learn, researchers who came to investigate, and community members who'd embraced the Foundation as part of their local heritage. The mountains that had protected Stone family secrets for 5 generations now protected something even more valuable. A place where historical truth could be preserved, shared, and honored. The sanctuary Thomas had built in the peaks above served as a research retreat for scholars studying suppressed histories, while the restored homestead became a symbol of how ordinary families could change the course of history through extraordinary courage. Marcus walked through the house each evening after the visitors had gone, touching the stones his great-grandfather had laid, running his fingers along the wooden beams his father had carved, sitting in the chair where Thomas had spent his final years protecting secrets that had finally found their voice. The loneliness that had defined his adult life had been replaced by a different kind of solitude, peaceful rather than bitter, purposeful rather than self-imposed. In the kitchen, he often paused at the spot where the hidden cellar entrance had waited for over a century to reveal its treasures. The passage remained open now, allowing visitors to see the Underground Railroad chambers and understand the risks their ancestors had accepted to help others find freedom. What had once been hidden in darkness was now illuminated by understanding, transformed from family burden into shared heritage. The Stone family name appeared now in history textbooks as an example of Civil War heroism rather than a footnote about mysterious disappearances and Confederate gold. Marcus's ancestors were finally remembered for what they'd actually done, risking everything to serve the cause of freedom and justice. The lies that had driven his family into isolation had been replaced by truth that brought them recognition and respect. As autumn painted the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and amber, Marcus stood where his journey had begun on the porch of the family homestead, looking out at the valley that had witnessed 5 generations of Stone family sacrifice. But now he wasn't alone. Sarah joined him, along with Foundation staff members who'd become the extended family. Marcus had never thought he'd have. The Stone family legacy would continue, but it would no longer require isolation, secrecy, or sacrifice. Instead, it would be preserved through education, shared through research, and honored through the simple act of ensuring that truth triumphed over the lies that had once threatened to bury it forever. Marcus had finally found his place in the world, not in the mountain wilderness he'd once thought was his only refuge, but in the community of people who understood that some truths are worth any sacrifice to preserve.